You should never pay your top therapist the same as your bottom therapist through top line compensation. And variable compensation is not bonuses and incentives. It is the maturity to say we have a doctoring profession where we have ethics and values and expertise, and they should be paid a percentage of the compensation or the net revenue or the collections that they bring in. That's what every top doctoring profession does. And physical therapists are way behind in that area.
All right, last time we talked about why healthcare platforms fail, and the headline surprised a lot of people. It got people very, very fired up, maybe because they didn't listen long enough. It's not private equity. It's not the ownership model. Maybe it's the operators. So today we're going to go deeper. Larry just dropped part 2 of this series, and this is where it gets uncomfortable because now we're not talking theory. We're talking about actual dysfunctions that keep blowing these things up. History keeps repeating these themselves. 5 of them. And the scary part, we've seen all 5 before, and we're still repeating them, just like history. So today we're breaking down where platforms actually go wrong and why smart people keep making the same mistakes and what the few operators who get it right are doing differently. So Larry, let's get into it. You said something that stuck with me. Failure is financing agnostic. That was the thing I think a lot of people last week when they heard you say PE isn't the bad guy. They didn't stick around long enough to maybe go deeper. Maybe that's the trick. But if it's not private equity, then what actually is the root problem here?
Yeah, so the root problem is that we keep treating American healthcare services like it's a scalable, dehumanized business product. And it isn't. CVS had 10.6 billion. Amazon had effectively unlimited capital. Walgreens had the biggest national distribution infrastructure than any P firm would ever have. They were all 3 public, and they all walked into primary care with resources that would make any private equity sponsor blush. All 3 ended up with impairment charges, clinic closures, full dismemberment within 3 years. So if the answer were just getting better financing, then those 3 would have certainly figured it out. But the actual problem is structural. Healthcare is a relational, locally embedded, reimbursement constrained, and clinician dependent. Those are sort of 4 characteristics, and they don't respond to capital the way that a consumer product or, say, a logistic business does. You can't centralize your way past them. You cannot acquire your way past them. You cannot hire sort of a McKinsey or a Bain team to optimize your past or optimize you past them at all. And the platforms that forget this, regardless of who's writing the check, end up in the same place. History does have a way of repeating itself, which is why I keep saying the financing is the accelerant, not the arsonist.
Right, but it sometimes is the most visible, so we blame the most visible.
Correct.
You mentioned that word over-centralization. My previous career was in broadcasting. We saw this. If you could manage 1 radio station, why not 100? Why not 1,000? You call over-centralization the original sin. Why does something like that looks like good management end up killing platforms in healthcare?
Because it sort of feels like good management right up until it doesn't. When the platform is scaling fast and the acquisition pipeline is full and the EBITDA is growing, centralizing HR, finance, and clinical protocols look like an operational discipline. It looked like a demand. It looked like a necessity, a default. But it looks like professionalizing a fragmented cottage industry. That's what we are as a cottage industry. It looks exactly what boards are asking for, but what's happening is you're dismantling the thing that makes the practice valuable. A patient's relationship with their hygienist, their PT, their primary care doctor. That's the product. The product is the relationship, the intangibles, the thing that is very, very difficult to scale and to quantify. That relationship is local, it's personal, and it also took a long time or years to build. Yeah. The moment you start optimizing it from a corporate office 4 states away, you're not running the business better, you're consuming the business. And by the time the revenue trend makes that visible, the founders are already gone, the culture is already hollowed out, and you're trying to hire your way back to something that you destroyed on a spreadsheet. You know, if you look at the Harvard postmortem on Steward, they named it explicitly. Failure to invest in patient care combined with financial engineering that extracted value instead of building it. That's centralization's end state when it goes wrong. 5 hospitals closed, 5,000 workers displaced, a CEO dodging a Senate subpoena. That's where, like, looks like good management eventually goes.
So then, at what point does a platform cross the line? If I could manage one and then 5 okay, maybe this is a fair or unfair question. At what point does it cross the line from helpful infrastructure and centralizing thing to actually what you just said, dismantling what actually made the business valuable?
Yeah, it evolves over a process. It starts out honoring the clinician. It ends up treating them like widget makers,
Yeah.
that they're just fungible commodities. So that line is crossed when the local operator loses what I call real authority, not influence, authority, decision-making processes. There's a difference.
Okay.
Shared infrastructure at times makes sense. Billing, credentialing, supply chain, marketing, technology. Nobody needs 50 EMR implementations across a platform. That's legitimately more efficient and it frees up clinical time. I've got no argument with that. But the line gets crossed when the decision on how many patients a clinician sees and what they're being paid for seeing them and what the patients see, which patients they see in terms of payer mix, and whether that practice keeps the culture that they built. Because all of a sudden, central management starts sending things out. And they say, you have to see this many patients, you're doing this much, you have to do this, you have to adopt this. And those decisions then migrate. They could migrate even to a regional operator or a COO who's never treated a patient. That's when they've stopped building infrastructure around the clinical business and they started replacing the clinical business with a management layer. So that's how that thing evolves. The patients eventually figure it out, referral sources figure it out, and then the clinicians figure out and they leave. They go down to something better. It's usually in that order, by the way.
Yep. And then the thing that made you valuable walks out the door and you're confused as to what happened. Yeah. You've said misaligned compensation isn't a bug, it's a feature. This is super zoomed in, and we've seen this a lot. We had a discussion before about KPIs when you're aiming at a target that isn't valuable in the long term. So what are these systems actually incentivizing clinicians to actually do?
Yeah, so this is a key out of the 5 dysfunctions. It's the effectively misaligning compensation, and it's 2 things, and they're both bad. The first is what I'll call the volume-driven model. Revenue per visit, daily patient counts, units per billing targets, where you explicitly tell clinicians that more is better, regardless of what the patient actually is coming in on that particular day. So you get you get these sort of treatment sessions structured around maximizing timed billing codes rather than clinical outcomes. It shifts, the incentive shifts from the love and meaningful work of seeing patients to external numbers, units, time codes, all those kind of things. And the clinicians who take on these cases have to because the schedule demands it. They try to optimize the schedule. You get throughput, if you will, disguised as sort of productivity. And then burnout isn't a side effect of that system. It's the logical output of asking, sort of a doctoral level professional to function like a widget in an assembly line. Again, it's that migration of the business into a model of manufacturing, if you will, rather than relation. It's a people business all about the relationships. The second failure is the flat salary model. Oh, we're going to pay our therapists X. Oh, and then the new class comes in a year and they're going to say, we're going to pay them X plus 10. Well, guess what? And then they go back to the other X and have to 10 up them. And this is really popular more in the physical therapy and the dental hygiene space. We build professionals where the only way you can increase your income is to stop seeing patients move into management. So our best clinicians, the ones with the deepest clinical skills and the strongest patient relationships, are now economically incentivized to become a regional manager. They're incentivized to leave clinical practice as soon as it's possible. Then we run studies wondering why we have workforce shortages. Yeah. Between 2023 and 2024, on the physician side, union petitions surged nearly 900%. 900%. in a profession that spent decades philosophically opposed to collective bargaining. They were against unions. When you see that number, that really implies that the compensation dysfunction isn't sort of theory. It's really a structural argument, structural response.
Let's talk about this other problem that you brought up, this altitude problem. Decisions getting made further and further from the clinical floor, where that business, the value that the organization provides actually happens. What's the real cost of that disconnect, that altitude problem?
Yeah, the real cost is that, by the time bad decisions become visible as the revenue line, the damage has been in process for, like a year to a year and a half. That's sort of a lag period, 12 to 18 months. A CFO who's never, seen a physical therapy episode designs a productivity metric. A compensation committee that's never worked in a clinical environment sets a pay structure. All these for doctoral, professionals. A regional director whose entire healthcare background is a consulting engagement, or maybe they worked at a multi-site and worked their way up,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all clinical efficiencies, from a spreadsheet. None of these decisions produce an immediate sort of catastrophic event. It happens over time, a slow degradation of clinical engagement, patient experience, referral relationships, and a real bigaboo retention. And by the time that degradation shows up in the numbers, the people who made those decisions have oftentimes moved on. They've had souped up, tricked up resumes, worked with search firms. I've had now success and growth in a multi-site, and they move on. I call that the altitude problem because the higher the decision that gets made, the less grounded it is, and the reality of where that care actually happens at the clinic. And in healthcare services, the care is the business. Everything else is supportive infrastructure. When the supportive infrastructure starts making business decisions about the care without understanding the care, you've inverted the model. And that in itself is a symptom of the dysfunction. The tail is now wagging the dog, and the dog is the part that actually generates the revenue.
Yeah. Let's get even scarier. Let's bring in Frankenstein to this equation. You've described what you call Frankenstein network, where many platforms prioritize acquisition, buying new things, absorbing things over actually integrating what they've already bought. Why does this happen?
Yeah, so let's get to the Frankenstein by setting some context here a little bit. See, acquisitions generate headlines, integration doesn't. When you close a 10 clinic deal, there's a press release. There's a multiple that went up. There's something to show the board at the next quarterly meeting. When you spend 18 months integrating that acquisition, aligning EHR systems, building shared culture, developing clinical staff, investing in same-store growth, there isn't a press release. The board doesn't really care. It's an expectation they have, but that can take 18 months. There's just quiet operational work that eventually shows up as margin improvement and retention. The way to judge an acquisition is you pay a multiple, and that multiple has to be brought down through a better return on that multiple in over a period of time. I think 18 months is a reasonable expectation. And in my experience, you can grow a company 20 to 30% over that time period. The problem is you start stacking all these acquisitions, which is what happened in all these dysfunctional companies, and they couldn't integrate. And one didn't get to 1.2.0, it got to 0.6 and 0.7. You see, PE incentive structures don't wait for the quiet operational work. They're on a 5-year hold period. Every quarter you're not acquiring is a quarter you're not building towards the exit multiple. So here's what you end up instead. That's what I call the Frankenstein network. Dozens of acquired practicing, each with its own EHR, each with its own culture, each with its own billing practice, stitched together under brand, shared name, and a shared debt load, with almost none of the operational synergies that justify the acquisition premium. Systems don't align, cultures clash. It's all one-sided central management telling you what you have to do. No area of collaboration, no fierce disagreement, no teamwork, none of the things, the tacit knowledge skills that you have to do when you really bring teams together. Then the clinicians who joined that platform, when they still had its original culture, they watch it get diluted with all these successive deals, and same-store growth, which is the actual proof that the business model works, never gets the investment it needs because the capital is always paying for the next acquisition or paying the interest on their acquisition. It's a great way to build a very impressive looking platform that is quietly hollowing out from the inside.
Yeah, looks great on paper while they're quietly, I guess, running out of cash.
Yes. Exactly.
Let's at least close on something hopeful. What are the platforms that actually get this right doing differently? This is the reason we study history all throughout school, right? We're supposed to watch the failures and piece together the things that coulda, shoulda, woulda happened. But who's doing it right?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second part of that carefully because the platforms doing this really well are usually private and they're not looking for attention. The ones that shout out about it the loudest are usually the ones that have the slickest decks and the most questionable unit economics. So I'll give you that pattern rather than the names, although I'm not afraid to name a few of them here. But what they share, let's talk about their commonalities. Clinician informed leadership at every level. They don't run off founders. They don't do those kind of things. They don't have this kind of, poster child, chief clinical officer joined at the hip of their COO as though that is some kind of big deal. But they don't care about clinical advisory boards that report up. But what they have is actual operators with actual authority in rooms where decisions get made. See, clinicians have transportable skills that have allowed them to be entrepreneurs and managers, and they've built businesses. Now you take them out of businesses? Doesn't make any sense. Compensation models where a clinician who produces more takes home more. It's realignment, not a Peloton sort of leaderboard with penalty tiers. They don't do the next acquisition until the last one gets integrated. They do success one at a time. They share systems. They bring on culture. They recognize that you have different cultures and history and legacy, but you bring them together and they create new commitments around that. They use same store growth as the primary metric, organic growth. The reason they do that is if you can't do something well organically, why should you ever be entitled to buy anything? The clinician entrepreneurs who built the local businesses, they stay in the platform one way or another. They keep equity. They have genuine operational authority. They still have ownership at the local level. They might have it at the top co level, but they really need it at the local level. They're not transitioned out 6 months under some, cockamamie CEO trying to make a name for themselves and say, oh, we got, running off founders as though that was built with some sort of strength. And here's the one ad that doesn't get enough attention. The professional managers in these platforms have verifiable track records of organic growth, not tricked up search firm resumes that claim top line growth, even though you bought a bunch of things, right? Specifically during the post-COVID period, this is what is incredibly important because this is the period of time when labor costs have spiked, supply chains broke, reimbursement got cut, and clinician shortages were the new. They were the new normal. Anyone could look at an operator in a free money environment from years ago where acquisitions were made and claim they had all kinds of growth. And that's what you see on these tricked up resumes is the bragging of growth. Which, by the way, I'm going to go back and redo 2 more additions to metrics that don't matter, and growth and scale are going to be the next few episodes. But the question is, what did these companies do? They grew and they couldn't buy their way into it. These are companies, quiet gainers. They didn't have to be flashy, shiny objects by buying new companies. The platforms that ask the questions in the hiring process are the ones that I will be watching. In dental, I could tell you Heartland Dental, a long-term DSO established by KKR, very thoughtful about how they do acquisitions and de novos. I think, you've seen some physical therapy companies in the early days who've collapsed, but they started out doing mostly de novos, then went to mostly acquisitions and then failed. So there are winners in this world, but they remain relatively quiet and understated.
Quiet and humble. All right, let's play a quick segment called Operate or Overrate. Just give me an overrate. You want to operate or overrate? Centralized clinical protocols. Is that overrated or underrated?
Centralized clinical protocols? I think that's probably underrated. I think you have to have a consensus-driven approach to clinical protocols from the standpoint of evidence and the hierarchy of evidence, and say, out of the framework of low back pain, these are the clinical prediction rules we're going to use. These are the algorithms that we're going to teach, the treatment approaches. Yes, we understand there are deviations and comorbidities and things off of them. But I know I always wanted physicians coming back to me and saying, I love the fact that when I send a low back pain patient, you do a clinical prediction rule or something and then engage them in a protocol. You don't have one person who just does manual therapy, another person that just does sports medicine, another person that just does McKenzie, another person that just does Ciriax. So I do believe that an organizational's value in clinic is deciding on the top 12 to 15 diagnoses and having treatment parameters and clinical prediction rules and evidence-based process, all they're driven through meta-analysis and through the Cochrane system for the hierarchy of evidence. Yeah, today I would call it overrated. I think in the future it will be underrated, but right now what you have is a lot of underfunded companies with shiny objects adding things to EMR packages, marketing lead generation, schedule optimizing. All they are doing is allowing the over centralization feature that I've talked about it to be accelerated. That's not a good thing. Where it can become a good thing, not optimizing EMR, not optimizing your schedule, not optimizing technology, optimizing humanness. What can I put in place that allows my therapists and my doctors to be more humane, to spend more time with their patients, to go home at the end of the day without the externalities of pressures on them? I have an article that I've written with Tim Flynn on the use of AI agents and how 5 agents running simultaneously in a physical therapist background will really enable the therapist to be more compassionate, empathetic, and spend more time with their patients. Now that is where AI would be underrated. If in fact, yeah. Oh, grossly overrated. Yeah. You should never pay your top therapist the same as your bottom therapist through top line compensation. And variable compensation is not bonuses and incentives. It is the maturity to say we have a doctoring profession where we have ethics and values and expertise, and they should be paid a percentage of the compensation or the net revenue or the collections that they bring in. That's what every top doctoring profession does. And physical therapists are way behind in that area. And now that you have such penny nickel margins that we've talked about, the biggest portion of the comp, 67%, is your labor. And out of that labor, you have to have a variable compensation shared risk with your therapists. This will move most of the compensation to therapists. Guess what? They're the ones who generate all the revenue and hopefully move compensation and move the number of overhead away from central management. The PT clinic, the dental clinic, the primary care clinic of the future is going to have a lot less headcount in revenue cycle management, credentialing, management in general, HR, finance, and that will allow the profit and loss statement to be rebalanced to a better margin, but only if you shift that compensation to the people who absolutely produce it. I'm very proletariat. I'm like, that's why I'm a big fan of Major League Baseball and what they've been able to do, where they reward the people that generate the revenues. In physical therapy, what we do is the opposite. We generate rewards for therapists that get out of therapy and move it more up the ladder towards central management. And that leads to partly of the 5 dysfunctions of healthcare platforms when they go awry.
All right, go deeper. If you're building, operating, or investing in healthcare, this is the stuff that actually matters and you should be paying attention to, not the pitch decks. They can be slicked up, not the multiple, the way business actually runs. If this hit, go read the full piece. Links in the show notes. It's worth your time. And if you're not already subscribed to The Operator, that's where Larry is writing this in real time, one problem at a time, and now available on all podcast platforms as well as YouTube. We'll see you next time here on The Operator.